Well, howdy everybody, and welcome back to the farm. Today's going to be a little different. Today we're going to be talking about strange memories that I had when I was a child. So this is going to be a genuine conspiracy farm today. We're going to be growing a crop of very strange images and very strange ideas that I have about my early childhood. So with my series on being a sorority security guard, everybody learned a lot about my early adulthood, from, say, age 19 to 26. But now we're going to talk about different points along a timeline from when I was just 4 years old in 1979, then when I was 8 years old in 1983, and then later when I was 12 years old in 1987. So I think most of my listeners will be interested in some of the unusual biographical details. If you're wondering why I ended up with such an odd point of view, or an odd style, or just a strange approach to life, and I think it's because of emotional habits that I had to develop when I was young, especially when it comes to fear, and in particular, fear of the unknown. Growing up, I wasn't afraid of anyone in my family. I always felt safe at home, at least from all the living humans that I was aware of. It turns out that the fear that I had to deal with when I was young involved things that maybe weren't alive or weren't human. And so at this point, I know everyone is kind of steeling themselves for the pain of realizing that this person that you've listened to is actually insane, when they find out that this isn't really a conspiracy farm, but a conspiracy depot next to a conspiracy mine, where the crazy ideas just keep piling up. Now, I'm sure most listeners by now recall that my father's side of the family comes from places like Alaska and Seattle, and that's really the offshoot of the LeCornu family that left the Deep South. My father's father was born in Mississippi. Like most of the LeCornus, the first LeCornu arrived in the New World in 1790. The name LeCornu goes back to the 1300s. As far as I can tell, the first LeCornu that I know of was a Norman French Knight Templar. But I digress. My mother's side of the family is almost entirely from Texas, with some roots stretching into Louisiana. And so, given those two facts, it might be strange to find out that I was born in San Diego, California, and my earliest memories were of San Diego, California. I had no idea what Texas looked like, and I lived with my mother and her parents and my brother, and everybody except me and my brother grew up in Texas. So why were we out there? Well, my mother was living with her parents after my parents divorced, and it was awesome. My mother worked, so I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, which was very instructive. I remember my grandmother teaching me how to count using a measuring tape. I actually think that helped because it made me immediately have to wrestle with the number 12 and how prevalent that is in all of our measurements. Now, my grandfather was the reason we were out there. He worked for the Navy. He would make sure to correct people if they said he was in the Navy. My grandfather was an Army man. He was a tough-talking, chain-smoking Army guy. Now, he quit smoking in the mid-1960s because my grandfather always kept up with the latest science, and when he first read in Scientific American that the rats that were painted with tobacco tar had developed cancer, my grandfather basically quit cold turkey. I don't think I would have had the strength to do that. I think my genetics are prone to extremes and obsessions. That's one reason why I don't play video games. I think I would get way too into them. They would just take up too much time and mental effort that I need for other things. So my grandfather worked for the Navy. But what did he do for the Navy? Well, he was a jet engine mechanic. And he and his team worked at the North Island Naval Base outside of San Diego. And in the late 1960s, his specialty was the F-4 Phantom. The primary fighter jet that the United States used over North Vietnam. While my father was a Marine infantry in South Vietnam, my grandfather was a critical component in keeping the carpet bombing in North Vietnam going. Whenever planes were damaged, they would get shipped back to the United States, and my grandfather's team was in charge of taking them apart, cleaning whatever needed to be cleaned, replacing whatever was damaged by shrapnel or bullets. Their job was to very quickly assemble a working engine, inspect it, certify it as airworthy, and get it back on the ship to go back to Vietnam. So here's where the story gets interesting. My grandfather knew that he was going to retire in 1980. He jumped right into the workforce after World War II. The man had really served his country. He was ready for a well-deserved rest. And of course, the first plan was to move back to Texas. And we moved back to the area that my mother's mother was from, which is around Hancomer, Texas, which is close to Anahuac and Winnie. And so my grandfather tended to own a lot of the land that people in my family lived on. He bought his mother the house on the hills outside of San Diego, and he'd visit her all the time. And I really liked her house. It was very comfortable, and she always had interesting snacks in the fridge. She had a dog that was not the most well-behaved dog, but we thought he was fun. Toto. He was the same kind of dog as in the Wizard of Oz. My mother's mother's mother, my grandfather's mother-in-law, lived in a house on one of those properties in Hancomer, Texas. Now, if you've never heard of Hancomer, Texas, you're not alone, and I don't blame you, because it kind of boils down to really 2 or 3 roads and where they intersect, and the houses along the roads and spread throughout the woods around there. Now, I've talked about Winnie being a very flat, swampy place, and Anahuac has a lot of bayous and swampy areas. Anahuac is one of the few places in Texas where you really do have to worry about alligators. So my grandfather bought 20 acres of new property outside of Winnie, Texas, and that's where he was going to build the house he was going to live in during his retirement. But for a few years during that time, the plan was we were going to stay in this old house in Hancomer that was mostly empty. It was a 3-bedroom place, and my mother's mother's mother occupied just one of the bedrooms. And the house was apparently built in the 1870s, so it was a pier and beam house. It didn't have a foundation. There was always something nesting under the house. My great-grandmother had a pretty cool place. The front of the house, where the circular drive was, and the garage my grandfather built for the cars, there was a big sycamore tree. It was really tall, kind of scarily tall when I was a kid. She had plenty of crepe myrtle trees. She raised ducks and chickens. She had a pear tree, a fig tree, and a pecan tree. And there was a field right next door to that property where a friend of the family had put 2 old horses out to pasture. And one of my chores as a kid was to take the hose and fill up the old 50-gallon barrels where the horses got their water from. And of course, that's important during Texas summers. I always tried to pet the horses, but they would just sort of trot away from me. They were old horses. They knew better than to let that dumb kid anywhere near them. And so during this time, I, as a child, had the great pleasure of going on road trips during the summer in the last few years of the 70s. By 1981, we were fully moved into Texas, and I was starting school at the Anahuac Independent School District. And so for the first few years of the 80s, we were still going back to San Diego every summer. Instead of our old house in San Diego, we would stay with my grandfather's mother. So I want to stress that overall, I have great memories of this time. I had a lot of toys that I liked. I remember The Muppet Show and The Muppet Movie. My mother took me and my brother to see Star Wars in 1977, but I wasn't quite 2 years old yet, and I don't remember it at all. My mother said I slept through most of it. But like I've said before, seeing the first Christopher Reeve Superman, I definitely remember that. I also vaguely remember Close Encounters. But if you watch that movie now, you'll see that it's way too slow and talky for a very young kid who just wants to see the aliens. I'm tired of seeing all these lights. So that's the context of the story. So let's imagine that this is one of those early trips to Texas. I was still living in that house in San Diego, and it was the summer of 1979. I recall watching The Muppet Movie at a drive-in, and The Muppet Movie was released in late June 1979. So I'm pretty sure my mother took me to see that because earlier in that month I had just turned 4 years old. And I loved the Muppets. I had a Kermit the Frog toy, and a Fozzie Bear, and of course, a Miss Piggy puppet. And so, sometime after that, we went to Texas, but then because of school and whatnot, we would come back to San Diego for the fall. And here's what I'm claiming. I think something weird happened on that trip. Now, the weird thing is I'm not sure exactly what happened. But of course, I have theories. One fair day in August of 1979, my family set out from Hancomer, Texas, driving to San Diego, California. A trip which, if you're really pushing it, still takes about 3 days, maybe 4, depending on how often you stop or how much sleep you want to get. In other words, how much shift driving you want to do. Because one thing you have to remember is that the car that we're traveling in is pretty comfortable. It's almost like a mobile hotel room, because it was a 1977 Lincoln Continental, a Mark V. So it was an enormous car that could still go really fast. I had the opportunity to drive it later on, and you immediately realize that the thing is kind of like a boat. It's enormous, but it's got this really good V8 engine, so you can really fly. And back then, there were no child seats or even a need for seat belts in the back seat. So my brother and I were in the back seat, and even though my mother was back there, we still had room to take a nap. I could stand up, completely stand up inside the car when I was 4. So I had my toys and my comic books, and I had a blast on that trip because I thought the desert was cool. You know, San Diego was sort of this urban area with lots of decorative landscaping. There are those mountains just east of San Diego. And I remember when I was a kid, I asked my mother where Texas was, and she pointed east and said, "It's on the other side of those mountains." Now, of course, I didn't put together at the time that once you got over those mountains, it was still a 3-day drive to get where we were going. The Muppet movie helped me pin down this date, and also the 8-track that we were listening to in the very high-end sound system that my grandfather had in that car. Right before that trip, an Earth, Wind, and Fire album was released on 8-track. So I have very fond memories of riding through the desert in a giant car, watching the scenery of southern New Mexico and southern Arizona zip by, while reading my Superman comics, enjoying the trip. Somewhere along the line, when we had wandered away from Interstate 10, probably to get gas or to stop at a hotel, I think something happened that only I had some memory of. Now, later on, we'll talk about why that seems to be an important clue. We'll talk about all the stuff that was going on in New Mexico. I don't know if you recall in a previous episode of Meet the Aliens, and I guess that gives you a clue as to where I'm going. This man named Phil Schneider, who was an engineer with a private contractor that was helping to build an underground military base in Dulce, New Mexico. And apparently, none of this was made public until Phil Schneider started talking about it in the 90s. Or at least he went around giving talks about what he saw and what happened to him, including the injuries that he had. He only had half of one hand, and he says that the other half was lasered off during a fight with some grays that they had stumbled upon while digging tunnels underground. Now, I wish we could ask Phil Schneider for more details, but, oh man, the poor guy committed suicide in the late 90s. He strangled himself. It was a pretty gross affair. But anyway, too bad so many of these scientists and engineers are either severely depressed or they like to go hiking in weird places where they might get lost. But anyway, Phil Schneider said that this incident occurred during a very critical point in the relationship between humans and the Greys. It had become apparent to the government that the Greys had violated the Greada Treaty that they had agreed to telepathically with President Eisenhower in 1954. And I mean, Grey is right there in the name of the treaty, Greada. But anyway, by the late 1970s, the Majestic 12 and the Deep State had realized that they were tricked, that they were given technology that humans were going to require decades to figure out how to use. And in return, we agreed to just a few thousand people being abducted. But that turned out to be tens of thousands, maybe much, much more. Now, the Greys had assured President Eisenhower that no one would be injured during the abductions. And they said, hey, they won't even remember what happened. We have technology that can manipulate the brain, and we can put in false memories. We can just delete memories. Like a driver who suddenly has an urge to pull over to the side of the road around 11 p.m., and then what seems like a few seconds later, it's 4 a.m. And that happens a lot. Now, of course, there are non-alien explanations for this stuff. So you can't just say, I don't remember what happened that one afternoon, so I guess I was abducted. I'm not going that route. I actually have quite a bit of weird circumstantial evidence that something psychologically traumatizing happened to me, and apparently not to the rest of my family, in New Mexico in August of 1979. Now, let's go back to Phil Schneider. He said that tensions between humans and the NHI that we had been dealing with had reached an all-time high, to the point where there was actually a brief armed conflict during the construction of one of the deep underground military bases in Dulce, New Mexico. So when did Phil Schneider get injured? When did that underground battle happen? When was it when the relationship between humans and NHI was at an all-time low? When was this? Well, it turns out the Battle of Dulce, which is what they're calling it, the Battle of Dulce happened in August of 1979. The late 70s and the early 80s was an absolute peak of the abduction phenomenon. If abductions seem like something that didn't happen until the early 60s and doesn't seem to be very common after the 1990s, well, there's a good reason for that. That's when it was going on the most. So what were they doing? We don't know. If any of you have ever heard the name Travis Walton was a contractor who worked for a lumber company, and he and his team were in northern Arizona harvesting some timber, and they saw a weird light, and they decided to go find out what it was. So Travis Walton wasn't abducted in the normal way. What had happened was, Walton was in a big truck with his friends, and they drove right up on the UFO deliberately. And not only that, Travis Walton got out of the truck to try to touch the UFO or see what was inside, and he got zapped. His friends saw some sort of beam come out of the vehicle and hit Travis and knock him back, and he fell to the ground, and they got scared and they drove off. And this is why police had them as suspects of foul play, possibly having murdered their coworker, Travis Walton, until 3 days later, when Travis Walton was apparently dumped unconscious right next to a payphone on the edge of town. So do I have any memories of UFOs or aliens or anything like that? Nope, not in the slightest. In fact, like I said before, I have good memories of the trip. But then things started to get weird when we got back to California. There were certain things that I just really didn't like anymore. I didn't want to look out any windows. I hated windows. I had a distinct feeling that if you looked out a window, sometimes there were terrible things outside the window. And that terrible thing was always just some kind of face looking at me. And I also remember that the face was always sort of eye level with me. The face was of something that wasn't much taller than me. And if I were sitting in the back seat of a car, I would look out the window, and this face would be right about the same height from the ground as my face, which would make it rather small. I also didn't like sunsets in particular. I would get really nervous when the sun went down. I would calm down after it got dark. It was during the sunset that I had a big problem. Like, I just felt like something terrible was going to happen. Also, when I got back, my mother says, and I remember this, saying that I saw a face next to my bed. Once again, low to the bed, not very high off the floor, and I drew the face. And no, it wasn't a gray. It wasn't this weird, upside-down, teardrop-looking head with the big black eyes. Nope, not at all. It was this weird, more human-looking kind of demon face. It usually was just red and like it didn't have skin on some parts or it had horns. It was generally more of a red demon monster type thing than a little gray thing. I didn't draw anything that looked like an alien. Another weird thing is that I was really nervous about this one commercial. It was a commercial featuring Orson Welles. And I wasn't scared of Orson Welles. I was scared of the music that played right after he said, "We will sell no wine before it's time." Now that I think about it, It's kind of weird to have a commercial for wine on TV. So me seeing this in the fall of 1979 on primetime network television makes perfect sense. And what was this music that played right after Orson Welles said his little tagline? Well, it was that very familiar musical phrase from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the one that goes, dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun. So I'm not sure why that was so scary, but I would add that to the collection of weird behaviors that seem to surround some kind of fear. And I don't think this was some kind of just generalized anxiety that I had as some kind of kid that was maybe not entirely neurotypical. But I don't think so. It went away. It faded. A year later, I was not drawing demons, and I was staring out of every window I could find with an unquenchable curiosity. And so, once we moved to Texas, I had a lot of new things to deal with, a lot of new things to learn, new friends to make, and so I kind of forgot about all this. After all, there was no actual scary memory. There were just memories of me being scared of weird things. So I didn't think this was part of some larger story until later in life, really not until 1988. When I first read a book called Communion by a guy named Whitley Strieber, and Whitley Strieber's weird experiences happened in the woods in upstate New York. However, Mr. Strieber had been having weird experiences since he was a child living outside of San Antonio. So he was a Texan, and his father was an Air Force officer who was stationed at Lackland Air Force Base right outside of San Antonio. And so he had some stories that got me thinking. In particular, I was not thinking about 1979. After all, I don't actually have a memory. And one day I might try hypnotic regression, but I'm a little concerned about what I might dig up there. Well, my attention wasn't on 1979. It was on 1983, when I was about 8 years old. I don't remember what part of the year it happened in, so I may have just been 7 still. And for this incident, I actually do remember something. I remember it being a very weird, busy, scary night. And I recall being tired the next day. Now, of course, I just thought I had a really bad dream. And I remember trying to remember the dream. All I could remember was lying down on my bed with my head toward the footboard of the bed. And I woke up and I'm looking at the headboard of the bed. And there's somebody sitting on the headboard. And I look at this thing. I remember it being all black, just a silhouette. I couldn't tell what kind of clothes it was wearing. But I remember it being kind of lanky, so it wasn't very bulky. And it was all black except its eyes. They weren't big or black. They were little and white. And they had a white part and a pupil, like a human eye. But they were sort of cartoonish and perfectly round, like they didn't have eyelids or anything. And it was just sitting there, just looking at me. And I remember I didn't do anything. I didn't jump up or scream or anything. And here's the weird part. Well, everybody's thinking, Vincent, this is kind of weird so far. What do you mean, this is the weird part? Yeah, you haven't heard the weird part yet. The weird part is that when I was a kid, I remember feeling weird telling people that that's what I remember because I knew it was wrong. I had a memory that didn't happen. That's a pretty vivid image. That's something that you're going to remember. It's going to stick with you. But there's something in my brain that says, that didn't happen. I'm pretty sure I didn't dream it either. So it wasn't part of a dream, and it didn't actually happen. So that's weird. And it really feels almost like that thing is sitting on the truth almost. The other thing is that I remember not being asleep. And if you had asked me back then to describe the night in one word, it would have been busy. The word busy. I remember thinking, that was a busy night. Like, a lot of things happened in the house. But all I remember is this weird thing. And I know that part didn't actually happen. Now, by 1984, the very next year, the foundation had been laid on our new house. The land had been cleared. And so we started to actually spend a lot of time at the new house, even though a lot of it was still bare plywood. We thought it was cool out there. And I had my notebook, and I was writing stories. And we loved watching Miami Vice. I didn't get into the whole alien thing until years later, well into my life in Winnie, Texas, and not Hancomer or San Diego. So at the end of this episode, I'll go ahead and tell a ghost story, something that doesn't have to do with aliens or NHI or the government or genetics or anything weird like that. It's just an old-fashioned ghost story because while our house outside of Winnie was brand new, the house in Hancomer was, in contrast, super old. It was built during Reconstruction in the late 19th century, so it had previous owners. And there was a sad, tragic story about the previous owners that we'll talk about later because I may have seen some sort of trace of that if Dick Halloran from The Shining is to be trusted. But more on that later. The ghost incident happened in 83 or 84. But we're going to talk about one fateful day in 1987 when I was very excited because I was at the San Jacinto Mall outside of Baytown, Texas. And if you're not from around there, you might look at the name and think it's San Jacinto, but you'd be wrong. As soon as the Texians won the Battle of San Jacinto, Sam Houston declared that it would be pronounced San Jacinto from then forward. So I was at the San Jacinto Mall in the mid-'80s, and the two places I wanted to go, either the video game arcade, of course, I asked for a handful of quarters, or Walden Books. And Walden Books was the main bookstore in malls back then. I had never even heard of Barnes & Noble. And there was this display for this new book called Communion by a guy named Whitley Strieber. Now, this was a weird paranormal book out there on the fringes, and it was published in the mid-1980s, so I don't expect anyone to remember what the cover looked like. But it famously had a large close-up of a gray alien on the cover. Obviously, not a photograph. It was a painting that Whitley Strieber had commissioned, almost like a police artist's sketch of the person who had abducted him. This was the first time I'd seen what was supposed to be an actual image of an extraterrestrial. I kind of freaked out when I saw that face on the cover of the book. Now, the weird thing is that normally gray aliens are kind of portrayed as frowning or looking kind of stern or mean. But Strieber wanted to get away from that because that's not the experience that he had. He said it was terrifying, but it was more like a benign indifference than anger. And so the face wasn't very stern. It was a painting that Whitley Strieber had commissioned to show his audience what he remembered seeing. And this particular gray alien had almost a little tiny smirk on his face. So it wasn't supposed to be scary. It wasn't, here are these demonic creatures that are trying to take over the world. It was, hey, I had a very strange experience, and this is one of the things I saw. So in other words, it was a little bit irrational for me to have such a strong reaction. I was extremely curious about the book, and later I did check it out from the Chambers County Library, and the whole time that I had the book at home, I always kept the front cover down. I couldn't look at the cover. I read the book super fast and was utterly fascinated. Because maybe you guys have figured this out, I think the underlying pattern here is that I tend to study what I'm afraid of. I think it's my way of relieving anxiety. Because if I feel like, well, if I've learned everything a human could possibly know about this, and, I'm physically able to fight, well, then I stand the best chance of anyone dealing with this problem. If I fail and die, then, there's some honor in that, because, it would take a lot. The day the universe decides my number is up, I want a nuclear ICBM headed directly for my nose, or something decisive. So anyway, what did Strieber say that he saw, and why did I think it had something to do with me? Well, let's talk about the stuff that Strieber kind of clued me into. Stuff that really got me thinking. Or maybe overthinking. So, when I checked Whitley Strieber's book out, I was in middle school, and I checked it out from a library. Little did I know that in less than 2 years after that, I would actually be working at that library. With the help of my mother, I became part of a youth job program where I was allowed to get a job at 14. And so I worked at the county government building in Winnie. The main county building and the main courthouse was, of course, in Anahuac, the county seat. But Winnie had its own courthouse, and it was tiny. And right next door, there was the Winnie branch of the county library. And it was a pretty small library, sort of one giant room. And one entire wall of that room was dedicated to romance novels. I learned a lot about romance novels. Whenever we got new boxes of them, I had to go in and find out the title and the author and type up the cards, and then paste the card pockets into the back of the books. I knew the Dewey Decimal System like the back of my hand. And I had read or browsed through so many of the books in the library that one day a judge came into the library and they were working on something. He needed to know when someone is driving mules and they have to say gee or haw. Those are the two commands that you give a mule. One of them means go to the right. One of them means go to the left. And this judge wanted to know or confirm which one was which. And I remembered the exact spot in the stacks where you could find a book that was called something like A Dictionary of Old West or Cowboy Terminology. And boy, it had everything in there. So I went and got him that book, and he found the answer. And by the way, I forgot which one was which. But I remember the story about me being right about something or doing something well. And little details about things like gee and haw, those are disposed of, no longer remembered. I put those things in the same place where I put my failures, or any time I was not so awesome. I don't remember that. I'm sure I've done bad things, but, you got to focus on the positive. And speaking of focusing on the positive, this stuff freaked me out and terrified me as a 7th grader. But I was still skeptical. I don't see a good reason to accept everything Whitley Strieber says as something that actually happened. But at the same time, I don't think that he has some sort of organic brain problem, and I don't think he's on some sort of big lying campaign to try to make money peddling these weird stories. I think Whitley Strieber's brain has been ransacked and overwritten so many times that he really might have trouble distinguishing his imagination from actual reality. But I do think there's some reality to what he's saying, even though what he was doing for money before he wrote Communion might give someone pause. He was a novelist. He grew up in the country outside of San Antonio, but he had that cabin in upstate New York to go to with his wife and his kid because he was doing very well financially, especially for a writer. And what kind of novels did Strieber write? Well, he wrote mostly horror novels and mythology, things like that. One of his novels, which was about werewolves, was made into a movie, The Wolfen, starring Rutger Hauer. He also wrote a very detailed and harrowing fictional account of nuclear war and what that would be like, and he called that book War Day. But after writing these novels, he encountered these weird incidents in the early 1980s in New York State, and he was so puzzled by his strange PTSD-type behavior that his wife made him see a therapist, and he ended up seeing a hypnotherapist who put him into a very relaxed state so that through hypnotic regression, he could uncover some of these memories that someone wanted deleted, someone wanted covered up permanently. And when the memories started coming out, they were super weird. They involved being carried out of his bedroom by little tiny 3-foot-tall dark blue creatures that wore these bulky dark-colored robes and hoods, like little blue monks. They seemed to be the worker drones in the ship that he was brought to, where they were tall, gray aliens that were kind of running the show. And of course, they put him on a metal table inside the ship, which was dark and damp and smelled of ammonia. And they put needles in his head, and they did the standard anal probing, of course. Now, about that, the anal probing. One idea in ufology is that they, whoever they are using our gut bacteria to control our moods and even our minds. There have been papers published recently where they've found these organic objects in human gut bacteria that they can't classify as viruses or bacteria or protozoans or anything like that. And they're super small. That's why we haven't seen them yet. And they're called obelisks, just like those structures that used to be built in ancient Egypt. Even though it's not an Egyptian word, it's a Greek word. Obeliskos means a sewing needle. So basically, a big needle. And these obelisks have a long, thin shape. But anyway, Whitley Strieber wasn't talking about obelisks. They didn't know about them in the 1980s. And so this was kind of a tough thing to deal with when you lived out 8 miles away from the nearest gas station in the middle of 20 acres of what used to be a rice field. And you're surrounded by other fields and cattle fields and hunting leases for deer or ducks. That's where I lived. It was so sparsely populated. There were no streetlights or anything. So at night, it got what they used to call country dark, meaning if it was overcast or under a new moon, you couldn't even see your hand in front of your face. And it was a place that was frequented by owls. We had some barn owls that got into the rafters of our garage. and their screeching and scratching and their big eyes caused some anxiety for me. And the main takeaway I got from Whitley Strieber is the idea of implanted and distorted memories, or missing time, where whole blocks of memory have been removed. And this is part and parcel of the abduction phenomenon. Barney and Betty Hill, who were abducted in 1961, also had to go under hypnotic regression. And boy, they recorded that on audio tape. And you can listen to their hypnotic regressions. And Barney Hill, in particular, was screaming and almost to tears like a child because he was so scared at what he was remembering. At first, all Barney and Betty Hill remembered was missing time while they were traveling on the road. And Whitley Strieber's initial memories were pretty banal and inconclusive also. For example, he spent a lot of time trying to figure out the source and the cause and the reasoning behind 9 loud knocks that he heard on his wall in his cabin in upstate New York. He was alone in the main room, if I recall, of the cabin at night when he heard a knocking, just like a hand knocking at a door, very firmly, except there were 2 weird things about the knocking. He said that they were perfectly spaced, like they were done by a metronome or a machine, and the knocking came from about 10 or 15 feet above the ground. So it wasn't on the front door. It was against one of the walls, way up near the ceiling. And Strieber was so puzzled and shaken by this that he actually went outside and tried to figure out what had happened, where the knocking came from. And so I started to see this pattern. People would be on the road driving, and they would either remember missing time, or they would start having these stress response behaviors and become afraid of bizarre things that normally aren't scary. And then they go under hypnotic regression, and they find out all kinds of funny business went on during the time their memories were blanked out. And often, people will remember memories that cap memories, red herring memories, I guess you could say. Strieber said that he would have dreams about seeing owls. And of course, when I read about that, the first thing I thought of was the solid black figure with the normal cartoonish eyes looking at me from the headboard of my bed. The pattern just really fit. So do I think I was abducted? I'm going to give it like a 30% chance. I had a pretty vivid imagination as a child, so who knows? But like I said, it is weird that I have this strange set of memories surrounding a trip through UFO Central at the peak of the abduction phenomenon. So I don't know. However, you do have to take Whitley Strieber's stuff with a kind of a little grain of salt. For example, Whitley Strieber seemed to believe someone who operated a bookstore, and they wrote Whitley Strieber a letter saying that shortly after his book was released, these 2 strange, small people, under 5 feet tall, dressed in hoodies, and let me go ahead and be clear, this guy is claiming that 2 grays dressed up and came into his bookstore because they just wanted to see the cover of Whitley Strieber's book for themselves. Yeah, I don't know if I'm buying that, especially because the guy said that they had taken a lot of effort to hide the fact that they were aliens, which, you would do. If I were an alien wanting to go to the mall in the 80s, I'd put on a hoodie and a wig, and I'd put the hood up over the wig, and I'd get myself some big sunglasses, and apparently, according to this bookstore operator, and, you gotta believe it, it's probably true, gray aliens have those weird mouths that can't really move, and those really pointy chins. So even with big sunglasses on, you're going to have a problem with that. So according to this guy, they wore big, thick scarves that covered their mouths and, their necks and chins, of course. So there's that. That was not actually technically in the book. It was in an appendix to Strieber's sequel to Communion called Transformation, where he starts uncovering memories from childhood and discovers weird connections to his dad and the Air Force and his childhood in San Antonio, and also the weird psychological element of the interaction that he was having with these supposed NHI. Now, whether this stuff was really true or not, I was just convinced enough to be terrified anytime the sun went down or I was somewhat alone in the dark, especially riding my bike out in the middle of nowhere. You can imagine that given the geographic location of my childhood and the long distances and isolation involved, I just had to make my peace with it. I had to come up with things I would try to do or say or think if I were being abducted. Not to try to stop it. I was pretty convinced I wouldn't be able to stop it. But I definitely had some questions. And, according to both Whitley Strieber and Travis Walton, they're pretty spindly little things that cannot deal with us in a physical sense. A human against one of these things would be like a Kodiak bear versus a child. And so they're very careful to do the paralyzing stuff with their little wands, and they can completely shut off the bodies and minds of people that they're not targeting. So that's why Whitley Strieber's wife and kid didn't have these weird PTSD experiences. As far as we can tell, they may have undergone some procedures, but they didn't seem to be the main target like Whitley was. And of course, now that I'm seeing this differential treatment with how they treat their target versus the people they just got to temporarily knock out so that they could do their work with the person that they're targeting. After I read that, I started thinking, is that why the other people in the car weren't scared of windows or freaking out about little things or fretting about it nervously almost 40 years later? So there's that. If you want to know what Vincent thinks about the possibility of having been abducted, there you go. If it happened at all, and I'm betting it didn't, but if it did, I think it happened in August of 1979, and then whatever happened on that weird night in 1983. Now, this was 1987, so there were a lot of songs on the radio that I liked at the time, and there was one that wasn't my favorite song anyway, but, I wouldn't change the station when it came on the radio. And for my youngest listeners, basically what I just said is I wouldn't skip it when it came up in the rotation. But back then, the rotation was controlled by some guy at a radio station, and you just hoped that he had good taste. But anyway, there was a song that I started to associate with this whole alien stuff and Whitley Strieber, and it was that Fleetwood Mac song, Sweet Little Lies. And the chorus was, tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies, tell me lies. Pretty simple chorus. And, of course, I started to kind of apply that to Whitley Strieber at first. Kind of like when I'm reading his book, I'm saying, oh, come on, Whitley, lie to me. Give me some interesting lies. But then, after reading the book, when I heard the song, I associated it more with the Grays, because everything they told Whitley Strieber was kind of baloney or confusing. And so I was like, okay, little Grays, tell me some lies and make them interesting. But I promised you guys a ghost story. A good, honest-to-God, old-fashioned ghost story. And so this story happened when I was 8 years old. Once again, 1983. But this wasn't a weird dream, and it didn't happen at night. It happened in broad daylight, and I was wide awake. I remember it vividly, and my mother remembered something about that particular day decades later. So there is some external corroboration. Now, we've already covered the basics of the context of this story. As you recall, at 8 years old, I'm living in Hancomer, in that old house that was built in the 1870s. And the house had a weird layout. The bedroom that I shared with my mother and brother was connected to the bathroom. And then on the other side of the bathroom was the master bedroom where my grandparents slept. Now, that master bedroom is where the original owners of the house slept. And supposedly, way back in that Reconstruction era, the man who owned the house developed tuberculosis. And he slowly declined as his wife took care of him. And according to the old story, at some point, his health had declined and his breathing was difficult, and he was suffering so much that the wife did the unthinkable, and she took a pillow and pressed it over his face until he had died from asphyxiation, which wasn't difficult and didn't take long because he was in such an extreme condition. Now, this story was well known, and my grandparents and my mother knew about the story, but for obvious reasons, they did not share this beautiful, uplifting story with me or my brother. But my mother did have her eyes peeled for strange stuff, I think, because she said that the first time I visited that house, which would have been when I was very, very small, like in 1976 or 77, because my mother said that as a toddler, when I visited that house, she saw me laughing and pointing and apparently talking to someone in the middle of the night or at random times. And she said that I didn't seem to be afraid at all. So there's that. So let's fast forward to 1983. I'm 8 years old, and I'm living there. In a couple of years, I will have moved on to Winnie, but I'm still in Hancomer, and my mother worked in Anahuac. My mother was a dispatcher for the Chambers County Sheriff's Department, and my grandparents bought a police scanner. And so the first time I used a police scanner was when I was 7. I learned what squelch was, and I learned about what frequencies the police were using. So late at night, my brother and I would listen to the police scanner, waiting to hear our mother's voice. And of course, it was all in that police 10 code and abbreviations, so we had no idea what she was saying. All we knew is we'd hear something like, 1040, 1040, and we'd be like, hey, that was Mama. Hey, there she was. And remember, there was no 911 system. You had to know the actual number of the sheriff if you were going to call law enforcement. It was a small place, a tight-knit community. In fact, because my mother worked there at the police station, at the courthouse, sometimes when some of the deputies happened to be patrolling or driving out Hancomer Way, they would drive by our house, and if they saw us outside, they might stop and say hello. Remember, we had that big circular driveway. You had the horse pasture on one side, the garage on the other, that gigantic sycamore tree, and the whole thing was kind of lined with crepe myrtles, and then right outside the front door of that old house was a pear tree that miraculously survived a lightning strike. So it was kind of a weird-looking tree, but it did produce fruit still. And I remember pear cobbler when I was a kid. But anyway, one day in 1983, we were outside. It was early afternoon. One of the sheriff's deputies drove by, and he pulled in his cruiser, and he gets out and he starts talking to my grandparents and my mother, and he sees me and he's like, oh, hey. He knew me well enough to know that I was primarily fascinated with his guns. I wanted to know what kind of gun it was and what kind of ammunition it used. And so he showed me it was a 38, and he gave me one of the 38 hollow point rounds that he kept bandolier style pushed through leather loops on his gun belt. So he just kind of lifted one of those out and handed it to me, and he said, hey, it's all yours. And of course, I was very excited. I would have been more happy if he had let me have his gun, or at least shoot it a couple of times, but I don't think he was going to let me do that. And my mother knew me even better than the deputy did, and she knew there was a non-zero chance that I was going to try to take that round apart, try to get the bullet separated from the casing, or I may have tried to build some sort of wooden gun that used a rubber band and a thumbtack or something to activate the primer and cause the round to go off. So my mother knew that kind of stuff was in her near future if she didn't have a plan. So she said, take that into the house and put it in my jewelry box so that, it would be there for safekeeping. And maybe when I was a little older, I could have more access to it, but not right now. So in this early afternoon scenario, with a 38 hollow point round in my hand, I go back into the house. And I'm the only person in the house at this time. Now, this house wasn't built like houses are now. It had a very 19th century layout because there were no real hallways. So you go in through the main front door. That leads you into a little parlor that's part of the kitchen. Then if you go through the kitchen and go past the stove and the fridge, you go into the living room. And by the way, the living room was where people congregated to talk. And so there was a coffee table and lots of places to sit and a fireplace, but no TV. So I go in through the kitchen, then into the living room, and then there was a doorway that led from the living room to a very high-trafficked part of the bedroom that I shared with my mother and brother. And so I went into that room, and I knew where my mother's jewelry box was, so I went straight to that and lifted up the lid and put the 38 round in one of the little cubby holes. But then, as I was closing the jewelry box, I heard something, and it sounded vaguely like labored breathing. It was kind of like someone struggling for breath, a wheezing sound. And this sound seems to be coming from the open door that leads from my bedroom to the bathroom. And remember what's on the other side of that bathroom? The master bedroom. So I look to where this sound seems to be coming from, and it's that doorway leading to that bathroom. And then I see something. Now, I didn't see a person. What I saw was kind of like what you see coming off of a hot asphalt surface on a hot summer day. It's that shimmering effect. And so that's what I saw, this sort of shimmering distortion. And right around where you would expect someone's head or face to be in the shimmering, I could almost make out eyes. But remember, I was 8 years old, and so the sound scared me enough. But once I figured out it wasn't another person that I lived with, and I saw this shimmering, and then I hear the sound again coming from the shimmering, this kind of like labored breathing sound. I did what any 8-year-old would do, and I bolted. I don't think I've ever run out of the house onto the front yard any faster. And my mother noticed that I just burst out the door. I almost knocked that screen door off its hinges. And here's what I told my mother. Nothing. Everybody was having a good time, still talking with the deputy. And here I come with this weird look on my face. And my mother asked what was wrong, and I said nothing. And then went about my business doing other stuff outside. I wasn't about to go back inside until the adults all went back in. And I didn't mention this story. I didn't say what I saw till I was in my 20s, and I was watching some program about ghost stories, and then I mentioned it. And my mother remembered that day and said, "Yeah, you were acting really strange. I was wondering what happened in the house." So I have two opposing hypotheses as to what happened. My more skeptical, scientific mind wants to say, look, there's no way that as a kid you didn't overhear something, even when you were asleep, about the story about the man dying in the master bedroom and his tuberculosis problems. I'm sure I picked that up somehow, even though my family took care to keep that story from me and my brother. But then there's, of course, the other explanation, which is that I did see something real, some kind of trace of the incident that happened. But ultimately, as I've gotten older, I'm resigning myself to the cold, hard fact that I'll never know for sure. Well, there's my ghost story. I'm sure it was a little disappointing, but, they can't all be bangers. And that's it for this volume of weird childhood memories. We're not done yet. More strange stuff happened to me when I was a kid, but not related to ghosts or aliens. I'm going to do an episode about my childhood experiences with firearms, which I didn't realize was bizarre and alarming to a lot of people who didn't grow up in rural Texas. I'm thinking of calling that episode My Life with Knives and Guns, and I'll be detailing the 2 separate times where someone put a knife to my throat. I think that gives you a sense of what kind of a person I was. I've mellowed out over the years. I was a lot higher on the jerk scale back then. But we'll talk about that later. Next week, we will probably go back to Stanley Kubrick, because I've sort of decided that the Full Metal Jacket episodes are going to also involve a lot of commentary about the history of the Marine Corps, where they came from, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Vietnam conflict. I'll also talk a lot about my personal connection with the film. My father was Marine infantry in Vietnam in 1968. So that's coming up later. And, if all else fails, I'll just have to go back and do 5 more hours about The Shining. I'm sure everyone would love that, but I'm just kidding. And so, until then, talk to you later.